Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance ESG. This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, I interview Curtis Shuck, founder and chairman of the Well Done Foundation. The Well Done Foundation is working to fight climate change through plugging orphaned or abandoned oil and gas wells. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates there are approximately 3.5 million unplugged abandoned wells scattered throughout the United States. The Well Done Foundation works with farmers and landowners, local and state governments, corporations, and not-for-profit organizations to locate abandoned wells, measure and document the carbon emissions, then plug the wells and restore the surrounding surface area to its original state. For the past 30 plus years, Curtis has passionately focused his extensive public service and private sector careers on oil and energy-related transportation project development, capital project delivery, and business development activities in the Pacific Northwest and the Mid-Continent. Curtis founded the Well Done Foundation after seeing firsthand the impacts of orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells on communities and the environment. Hi, everyone. This is Emilie Nadler from KBRA's ESG team. Thank you so much for joining me today, Curtis. I want to start by asking you about why you founded the Well Done Foundation and what is the company's mission?
Sure. Thanks, Emily. It's great to see you. And for me, the journey of the Well Done Foundation started on July 25th of 2019 when I was up in northern Montana on a completely different mission. I was actually up in a consulting role working with farmers and talking with them about moving grain to Pacific ports using rail through an inland port that I represented in Shelby, Montana, which is about 15 miles from the Canadian border. So we were out on a crop tour, which of course, farmers always love to show off their stuff. So we were out looking at a beautiful stand of spring wheat that was just about to get harvested. And I noticed as we were in the field that there was these junk piles everywhere and distinct odor of methane type gas. And so I started to ask the farmers, well, what is this? And they said, well, these are orphan wells. And if you look around, they're everywhere out here. And of course, once you see one, you see them all. For me, throughout the rest of that day, it was just this image that I couldn't get out of my mind. The immediate shock to me was sort of the visual impact and then the sensory impact of the gas. This is just not good for the industry. Like this in no universe is okay to leave something like that behind. And so that evening, as I was driving back to Bozeman, which is about a 4-hour trip, I just couldn't get that image out of my mind and felt that there had to be a way to do something. Of course, this is long before orphan wells were cool. At that point, they were everyone's dirty little secret. Come to find out, nobody wanted to talk about them. The industry, certainly the regulatory agencies. For me, the real pivot point, if you would, was that impact of this just isn't right. And by the time I got back to Bozeman at 1 a.m, my wife was in Bozeman on the other end of the phone. But we had secured the domain names for the Well Done Foundation and the various states that we thought that we could operate in, signed up with the Secretary of State with Well Done Foundation. And that's really what launched it. We had no idea where we were going, but just felt compelled that we needed to do something. So that was the start. And so our mission is to identify orphan wells, to quantify the methane gas, and then make plans to plug, abandon, and then restore the surface back to its original state. That's what we've been doing. We just actually plugged 28th well. And going strong. We'll probably be 50 deep by the end of this year. Things are really starting to ramp up, but what an exciting time.
Wow, very exciting. And congratulations on number 28. So how exactly does an oil well become abandoned? Is it corporate negligence or is something else that's at work here?
There seems like there's plenty of blame to go around. First of all, from the Well Done perspective is that we are always focused on staying on the high road. We're not out there to fling poo and point fingers. We're the get stuff done group that just takes action. But with that said, it's a combination of wells transferring and trading hands from their original owners and drillers who may have very well been a tier one super major type through the series of transactions and trades, sales and assignments and things like that. They go from tier one, tier two, three, four, five, all the way down to like mom and pop well. And it's usually at about that point in a well's history, and there are some exceptions, but it's about that point in the well's history where economic conditions may change, the viability of the company could change, deaths in the family, any numbers of things. Then what happens is that there's no longer by definition, an orphan well is one that has no responsible financial party who's available in the mix. And there's not the ability to go back through generations of owners typically to get to somebody who's got deeper pockets. So what happens then is that those wells become essentially what we call wards of the state. By default, the landowners typically, in our experience, are the ones that get left holding the bag, especially where there's a split estate where the surface ownership and the mineral rights ownerships have been bifurcated. Some point, in the history of the property, Uncle Tom, 3 or 4 generations ago, needed some extra walking around money. So he rolled off the mineral rights, and now there's any number of owners. But that's typically the process. So these wells sort of go through these transitions. Part of the challenge also has been, of course, on the regulatory side, is that the regulators, and it's not necessarily the fault of the regulators, because regulators, remember, are typically governed by elected officials. And so lots of fingers to point, but there may have been a bond at some point that was posted for those wells. And of course, back in the legacy days, those bonds were woefully undervalued to be able to address any of the actual costs associated with a plug-in and abandonment at the end of the day. But, what we found, and when I first started in 2019, remember, everybody's dirty little secret, and nobody had any money. Like most of the states, then they didn't have these deep pockets or these big kitties to be able to address these orphan well issues. And so for me, the driver at that point was really about how do we develop an alternative funding stream. So back in the days, and just for full disclosure, the Well Done Foundation has not accepted a single dollar of taxpayer money to plug a well anywhere in the United States, right? That's just not our program. We feel that there's a market-based solution. And so that's why in 2020 early, we started working with the American Carbon Registry for this alternative market-based funding approach. But that's how the wells kind of come into the universe. Just a quick little side note, there's an estimate of 2 to 3 million of these orphan wells that are out there now. I would tell you there is equally as many of orphan well potentials that are coming down the pipeline. What happens is these wells, as they reach the end of their economic life, they reach the end of their producing life, then what happens is the benefit to produce goes down and the cost to plug goes up. What we're finding now is we're in this bit of a perfect storm whereby 90% of the oil in the United States, oil and gas in the US today, are being produced from less than 10% of the overall number of wells. And that is continuing to sort of invert like that. This notion of, that's great, the government's going to write this check and we're going to go plug all of the orphan wells. The issue is that's not even close to being what's actually happening. Number one, the money doesn't go far enough. Number two, like I said, there's this whole next wave that's headed towards us. This isn't anything that's going away soon, and that's why this notion of a market-based approach is really critical.
So I'd like to just talk a little bit more about what problems these wells pose. So obviously the emissions that leak from abandoned wells pose a huge environmental risk, but do these wells have the potential to harm other aspects of the ecosystem?
Yeah, and that's a really great point. So, our focus typically is on the emission component. What is the harmful methane gas or other gases, H2S, for instance, hydrogen sulfide, or cancer causing agents like hexanes that are emitting from these wells are a focus. But we find often that these open well bores or failing well bores become then conduits, if you would, or pathways for things like brine water to escape into and contaminate surface water and groundwater, aquifers for hydrocarbons, oil to make their way to the surface. And we see that unfortunately all over the place. And so for the Well Done Foundation is we're not just looking at the emission factor. We are taking these other items into consideration. And probably the most dramatic, and certainly one that's been receiving a lot of press here recently, but those problems have been going on for generations, you just haven't heard about them as much, are the public safety concerns. Because remember, in some of these orphan wells, and not in all, but in some, there is a tremendous amount of stored energy, whether that is gas or oil or pressure of some sort. That this infrastructure that makes up these orphan wells, the thing to remember is that it's either failing or it has already failed. It's not in great shape. Like we're working on wells today that are 100 years old. Many of those have been in an abandoned or an orphan state for more than 30 years. Think about your car or your home. If you don't ever do anything to those assets for that long of a period of time, just the simple external environment is going to wreak havoc, not to mention the internal environment of corrosion and some of the gases that these wells are exposed to. With that said, that's really the danger. Certainly methane is the focus from the impact to the climate and to the environment, but there are these other elements. So as we're prioritizing wells in our universe, then we do take those other factors into consideration. And probably the biggest mover for us, again, is going to be the proximity to dwellings or residences and the potential for human danger.
I think that this is especially interesting topic for me, just coming from a background in corporate ESG, because it really is an issue you don't hear much about. So has that been part of the challenge in your work, educating people on the harm that these abandoned wells pose?
Oh my gosh, I can tell you that when I first went down this pathway in 2020, the vision happened in July of 2019. Early in 2020, we adopted our first wells in November of 2019. Started doing research and quantification of gas and measurements and trying to really get our hands around what we actually had, because part of the challenge at that point, Emilie, is that the wells that we were working on in Montana initially didn't match any of the data that was publicly available from like the EPA or some of the academia. It's a real head scratcher. It's like, well, am I doing the math wrong? Am I not figuring this out? But the reality is that the data that they were basing their findings on was from such a very small subset of wells that it just didn't take into consideration what we were finding. With that said, as I started to go into the market, if you would, early in 2020, to look for funding to help to underwrite our work, because I had been paying for everything out of my own pocket, formed the foundation, car washes and bake sales, for raising money for this work, which is very expensive, by the way. You got to have lots of car washes, lots of bake sales. Hard to have a winter car wash in Montana. But as we started to approach the corporate ESG world, they were looking at us like, you're crazy. I mean, we're used to forestry or nature-based credits and this whole notion of industrial methane. And then, of course, think of the time period, then COVID hit, right? As COVID started to take shape and overshadow everything, change our whole lives forever, this discussion became even harder. So as we started to approach the carbon registries, because again, from the beginning, I felt that there needed to be a market-based solution in order for this to really get legs and get traction and be able to be implemented at a larger scale. So as we started to approach folks like the Gold Standard or Vera, who are these large, reputable carbon registries, they looked at me like I was from outer space. And it was super difficult because, again, it was like every conversation took 90% of my time to even explain what we're talking about. When we were first introduced then to the American Carbon Registry, it was very refreshing because they had looked at potential opportunity. But again, because they were relying on the publicly available data on the amount of methane being emitted from the wells, that they just couldn't see a business case behind it. And so when we approached them with the Well Done Foundation model of a nonprofit and not needing necessarily the carbon offset to carry the entire weight of the project, but we could then bring in corporate donations and sponsorships and things like that to help lift that up, then all of a sudden it made sense. We were very refreshed. I was personally relieved when they got what we were talking about. From the first call to when we were entering into an agreement was literally a couple of weeks. I mean, they came back to us immediately, said, look, we love what you're doing. Let's make this happen. That's what really started to kick it off. Of course, we were still in the middle of COVID and what have you. We actually plugged our first well on Earth Day of 2020 in April 22nd of 2020. And like I said, we just finished number 28. Got more wells and since, literally and figuratively, I guess, right? We're getting after it. And that's what's been so exciting.
So you touched on a little bit about the regulatory side of things, but I would like to ask you a little bit more about that. I'm assuming this is a global issue, and is it a focus for NGOs, governments, and other actors in their efforts to mitigate climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, one of the things, and I'm just going to say if it isn't, it should. And here's why. Because this work that we do and that others are doing now too is so immediately impactful. I mean, it's literally gas on, gas off. Nothing against trees and nothing against nature-based credits, all important. I mean, you have to have a mixed bag and a diverse portfolio. But the reality is this stuff delivers immediate climate benefits. With that, it really does need to be. Now, there are complexities, certainly at a global scale. So number one, you're absolutely right. This is a global issue. We all breathe the same air. We all are faced with these same things. So just because we're plugging wells in Montana or in Louisiana or here in New Mexico or wherever we're at, we all share the space. So there is a connectivity that happens there. Part of the challenge can be, and we've actually been addressing this in places like South America, Southeast Asia, East Europe, is that because of the ownership, if you would, of the mineral rights or the ownership of the property where the surface, even where it could be owned by the state, if you would, or owned by the crown in Canada, that then from an ESG perspective or, a finance perspective can make the hurdle of things like additionality more difficult to get to. The reality is the impact is still there, right? So we should still find a way to plug those wells to stop those emissions happening because they're real. Whether it's something that you can turn a carbon credit for or not is irrelevant if really our focus is on making things better than the way that we found.
So my last question for you is really just what is kind of your hope for the future of the Well Done Foundation and just more broadly orphaned wells in the US and globally?
Well, it is an exciting time. The Well Done Foundation, as a 501c3, I mean, look, we know we're not going to be the ones to plug every orphan well out there. We hope that we're part of the narrative and have a seat at the table in terms of offering some thought leadership and offering education. One of the things that we've been doing in addition to our own plugging and abandonment, but we do lead a series of camps, educational opportunities for people, and we've been training regulators and we're working with colleges and universities, the national laboratories, USGS. We just entered into an agreement with them on some technical assistance stuff that we're working on back and forth. So I see that our role is going to continue to increase in that education and awareness piece. And in fact, we're just launching now a certification opportunity for what's called a QMS, which is a term of art that the Department of Interior has used, as well as the American Carbon Registry. And the QMS is a qualified measurement specialist. And so what we're doing now is we're actually offering a certification, a training for these qualified measurement specialists. One of the things that's unique about the Well Done Foundation is we have so many orphan wells now that are in our universe that we're able to use those as training tools. So it's, instead of just sitting in a classroom and talking about orphan well theory, we actually take people into the field where they can work in a safe environment alongside our team then to learn how to measure, monitor. And we've got folks that come out and join us as we're plugging wells. And I see that as becoming a bigger focus for our organization, is that sort of that educational type of a component. It's a very exciting time. Our mission is to lay the groundwork and hopefully inspire others, right, to take action and to do this work, as hopefully as inspired as I was on that July day of 2019.
Great. Well, that seems like a hopeful message to end on. And I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of great things that happen with the Well Done Foundation. So we'll look forward to watching those happen. But thank you again, Curtis, for joining me. This has been a really interesting conversation. And I personally have learned a lot, and I think our listeners will learn a lot from it as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Emilie.
This concludes our episode. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG weekly roundup newsletter.